All right, front row dads. I got Matt Carter with me. What's up, Matt?
Hey, how are you doing?
Dr. Matt, I should say.
Dr. Mac.
Dr. Matt. Although you did say you gave everybody permission to call you Matt.
That's right.
For your
I'm very.
students, you said they don't have to call you professor. You tell them that on day one.
I still, when people call me Professor Carter, I think that there's another professor who has the same last name as me. But I've even realized I just respond best to Matt.
How long have you been teaching?
This is the end of my 6th year, so I'm about to start my 7th year at Williams College, and I like it a lot here.
Cool. Where's Williams?
Fun. It's in Western Massachusetts. It's in the Berkshires. Yeah, I grew up on the West Coast originally, and so this is my first time living in the East Coast. But I think the Berkshires is the friendliest introduction to the East Coast one might get. It's very outdoorsy, and it actually reminds me of the West Coast a lot.
Oh, that's awesome. So you grew up on the West Coast. What part?
Seattle. I grew up in Seattle, and then I lived up and down the West Coast for various schools and things like that. And we traveled to Oregon and California sometimes when I was growing up. And I lived in the Bay Area for 6 years, but I grew up in the Seattle area. So I like coffee and bagels with lox and cheese and grunge music. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about your history. I want to get to what you do now, which is why I reached out. I wanted to talk about sleep, which is something that I know that you're very well versed in. So I'm excited to get to that. But so that people can know a little bit about your life and your history, just a little snapshot about what was life like for you as a kid.
As a young kid?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Yeah. So growing up in Seattle, I think I had a really good childhood. Actually, I lived close to a place in Seattle called Green Lake, and it was a nice community. Green Lake is a little lake that has.
Sounds like a nice community.
Yeah. No, it is. It's a lake. It's a 3-mile circumference around the lake, and then around the lake are things like ice cream shops and community centers and places where kids can learn how to play basketball and join whatever kind of sport or youth group that they want. And I remember actually being a pretty diverse place as well. I had friends from all walks of life. And then when I was 12, actually, my family moved to a suburb of Seattle. It wasn't in Seattle itself. It was called Bothell, Washington. And that was Bothell is fine in its own right, but I missed Seattle. And then I went to college in Washington State and graduate school in California. And but I think my childhood was pretty great.
It's awesome, man. What's one thing that you learned from your parents that specifically stands out that you're grateful for?
What a great question. Actually, this is. I hope this answer doesn't make it sound like there's not more to say, but actually when I think of my parents, I actually think a lot of times about what I didn't have to worry about. As my parents didn't take too much time to travel away from us. They rarely drank, and when they did drink, they would drink maybe 1 or 2 drinks. And so I never ever remember a time when I saw my parents intoxicated, when I got the sense that they didn't want to be home with us. And actually, that's one of those realizations you don't have until later in life. I don't even think until I went to college I ever once realized that I never saw my parents in a situation in which they weren't in control and in which I didn't feel completely safe all the time. And I know a lot of people who, sometimes I hear stories about other people's parents, and they had a great childhood and loved their parents as well. But every now and then I'll hear like, yeah, one time they were scared because their father came home drunk, or because somebody was traveling on a lot of trips. And I had a friend who told me that whenever she looked up and saw an airplane in the sky, she would say daddy, because she knew her dad would go on business trips a lot. And so I was very fortunate not to have to worry about that. My every now and then my parents would go on trips, but they were very loving and supportive. If I did something in school, they would come watch. It's one of those things, though. It's just, it's funny how as a kid you don't really realize that. It's just like, when you are a kid, you don't. In fact, you're even maybe somewhat annoyed. You wish your parents wouldn't come to everything, and you wish your parents would go out more and stuff. And I always Yeah, I don't know, but it's very lucky in retrospect.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is, to me, the greatest gifts are the ones that grow in value over time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that where you recognize that these gifts that you've been given as a kid grow in value over time. I often told the story about the time that my dad gave me for it was either Christmas or a birthday. I can't remember at this point, but he gave me a letter instead of a present. And the letter was actually a donation that he had made to a family in a third world country. He donated a flock of geese. And he said, because of this flock of geese that were donated in your honor, it was the first time this has ever happened in my life, where somebody donated something on my behalf and said, this family will eat for a year. And I remember getting it. And I probably had both reactions of, man, it's kind of cool, but like, yeah, it's not as cool as a real present, you know?
Right.
And, but what I've noticed about that gift is that every year I feel more and more grateful that my dad had the courage to give me something like that, where I might not have responded with like, you're the best dad in the world. But now I look back and say, I'm so grateful that he stood for, important values and like expressed that within our family.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about your family now. Tell us about what's going on at home.
So it's a very eventful time. I have 2 kids that are almost 9 and almost 5, but then my wife actually just had a baby. So we actually had
congrats.
a baby. Yesterday was her 1-month birthday. And so now we have 3 kids. It feels weird just to say that, but it's, neither my wife or I expected that we would have 3 kids. I think when we first set out to have a family. And so she wasn't an accident, but I think we always thought of 2 kids, and then we thought, let's just go one more. So we did that.
How long have you and your wife been together?
We've been together since college, which is, we met in 1998. So it's been 21 years since I've known her. Yeah.
Holy cow, man. That's great. What have you learned about relationships in the last 21 years? It's like, what haven't I learned about relationships?
Yeah, no, what a great question. It's just interesting how circumstances of life just change you and change your life circumstances. And if a relationship is fluid enough, then I think that we've been able to stay together and be happy with one another just because we've been malleable to life's changes and living in different places. And, life with kids is completely different to life without kids. I think you have to make so many adjustments, and I think figuring out how to make it work is, I don't know, it's taken effort. I never really understood when my wife and I got married. Everyone was talking about, it was mostly celebrating when we got married, but, every now and then somebody would say something deep, like, make sure to work through the tough times and, figure things out. And I wasn't so rosy that I didn't expect any tough times, but I didn't really fully appreciate what everyone was saying until we had kids. I think that, it threw everything for such a loop and changes your whole schedule and what you're able to do that, I realized, part of having kids is learning how to refigure out your relationship to your spouse. It's, everything changes.
Well said, man. That's really great. Yeah, exactly. Just talk a little bit about how I found you. I found your TED Talk, which was great.
Yeah.
And so that'll actually be a great transition to talk about what you do professionally and why we also wanted to catch up today, which I alluded to earlier. So let's ask this question. What was your hope with the TED Talk? Because I think that'll sum up what it was all about. What did you hope to get out to the world? What was the idea worth spreading?
Yeah, no, it was a great question. I could even just back up a step and say that, but before I was asked to do the TED Talk, I really give as a outreach opportunity talking about sleep and talking about the importance of a good night's sleep. And in my professional life, I teach classes in physiology and neuroscience, and then my lab studies sleep. And so I work with mice, and the students in my lab and we study sleep, the scientific basis of it and how the brain controls it and what happens in the brain and body during sleep. But before I became a professor, when I was a postdoctoral fellow, I was at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I heard that there was a group that was looking for someone to talk to a general audience about sleep, not from a scientific point of view, but more for a general point of view. It was about science, but not so much about what is the brain doing, but more just like what are some good what advice would you give to people about getting sleep? And I really loved doing that, and I sought out other opportunities to do it, and I was just surprised. I guess this is something something maybe we could talk about. But one of the things about sleep that I'm just so surprised by is just how much people don't know about sleep. And I think compared to other behaviors people do, it's just, the more I learned about sleep when I was a graduate student, the more I, in some ways, got mad, because I learned things that, not mad at any one person, but I learned things that I was just sort of always thinking, how come I didn't know that before? Or why isn't this, sort of in the public discourse a lot more? And so I'm not exactly sure the chain of events that led to being asked to give this TED Talk. I got an email, and they said somebody had thought of me for this, and I thought that would be a great platform. But my goal, to get back to your question, for the TED Talk was as soon as I was invited to do it, I just thought, okay, well, this would be a nice opportunity to try to encapsulate what I think about sleep, and giving advice about sleep to a larger audience than just Williams students. And I've actually been very happy with how it went. If anybody's ever offered the opportunity to give one of these TED Talks, it's been a great platform, and I love seeing how many people have seen it. And I get emails every now and then out of the blue from somebody who's seen it, who has a follow-up question, and it's a great platform to talk more about things that are interesting.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
What type of feedback have you gotten? What value have you noticed that people are getting out of it? What behaviors are changing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. What I love about it actually is I've gotten emails from people all over the place. I mean, just from, not even just in the United States. And so a lot of times it's just a very specific question that is applicable to some habit they have. They say, well, I like to do this. Is this bad to do at night?
Yeah.
And I always have to caution everybody that I'm not a medical doctor, and I know a lot about this from reading about it and from studying it. But I always have to remind people, it's like on a day-to-day basis, I usually work with mice, but to the extent to which I can answer questions, it's just interesting to see how, I guess something that surprised me is how many different routines people have. This is like, something that I know how I get ready for bed, and I know what we were trying to do with our kids, and how I try to put our kids to bed. And I, know the general appreciation for how movies and television shows depict going to bed. But it's interesting to hear, actually, it's one of those things you just never talk about, how most people go to bed. Some people
How do you go to bed?
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's a very good question.
Tell us about your nighttime routine.
Yeah, it's when I'm good. So I should even just come right out and say sometimes I'm good, and sometimes I need to be better at it. And it's funny because here I am, giving advice, and I would freely admit that I think actually sleep hygiene is just like eating. It's you could say you're going to eat better and have good nutrition, but everyone, it would be really sad if someone never had a piece of cake or some ice cream every now and then. So I think that the sleep actually is the same way. I think most of the time I get ready for bed, I try to be really deliberate about it. I try to have a good routine where you go through the same steps every night. I think people find different success through different things, but one of the big things I do is try not to look at screens. I don't look at no phones or iPads or computers at least like 30 or 60 minutes before I go to bed, and I try to read. I think reading before bed is I don't know, it just it relaxes me, and then I usually stop reading because I realize that my eyes have closed, and I'm no longer reading, even if the book's really good. I just find that that's something that works for me.
That's your cue.
That's my cue, yeah. But where I get lazy about it is, most of the time I'm doing this in my own bed. But I have to admit, just in the context of, like the person eating some ice cream or cake every now and then, that sometimes I'll sort of doze off while I'm reading on the couch, and so I'll wake up and, now that we have 3 kids, especially, my wife is sometimes with one of the kids, and I've put the other kids to bed, or sometimes, I actually, one of the hard things about going to bed when you're a father is I bet a lot of people would appreciate this, is like a lot of times I'll put the kids to bed and I'll just fall asleep right with them, and I won't
absolutely.
So it's actually an informative thing about how much sleep you're getting, is if you put your kids to bed at depending on their ages, obviously, but if your kids are going to bed at 8 or 9, and you fall asleep with them, then there's a chance that you're probably not getting enough sleep yourself. You know, it's if you normally go to bed at 10 or 11 and you're putting kids to bed at 8:30 or 9 and you fall asleep with them, then that's, I think, a good sign your body is telling you that you're not getting as much sleep as you need. But I guess the question is, isn't that what you do about it? But yeah, sometimes I'll fall asleep, putting my kids to bed, and then I'll realize that the things I was going to do afterwards, there's no chance I'm going to do them well. So I'll just try to go to sleep then too. But then other times, there are some nights I have to put the kids to bed, and then I'll come back to the office for an hour or something, and I'll just try to prepare something for the next day. But in general, I find that not looking at screens and reading are the
That's
two
a big
things
factor.
that work really well for me. Yeah.
What are you hoping to learn by studying mice? Like, what is the objective that you're after?
Right. Yeah. So in the lab, we actually study very specifically the parts of the brain that are active or influencing sleep states. And so when people think about the brain, they usually think of, what they see on, in diagrams or something as, like your squiggly gray brain and things. And it's, you think of it as like a one organ, kind of just like your heart is an organ or your liver is an organ. And it seems like your brain is doing the same thing, but the brain is really just a bureaucracy of lots of different kinds of cells. And each of those different groups of cells can, in a way, be thought of as their own little organ.
Yeah.
And so, and it's ridiculously complex. I mean, it's sort of like a city, actually. I mean, I think you could think of, like we were talking about Seattle. So I can refer to Seattle and we can think of Seattle as like an entity in itself, but obviously Seattle's got neighborhoods and then you've got different kinds of people within those neighborhoods. And so what we're interested in my lab is the very specific neurons that influence different states of sleep and what their role is. And so what we're able to do is actually in mice is to turn those neurons on or off whenever we'd like to, and then ask how that changes the mouse's sleep behavior. And so
using what? How are you turning the neurons on or off?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. There's a couple different methods we take. There's in most rodent neuroscience labs now. About 10 years ago, there were a couple techniques that were invented where you can actually directly go into a mouse's brain and actually stimulate neurons very specifically. One technique actually uses light. There's a way to make neurons light sensitive, and by shining certain kinds of light on those neurons, you can either stimulate them or a different color of light. You can turn them off, and you have to play these molecular tricks in order to do it. But once you've solved,
I can just imagine this one mouse is like, yeah, I can't sleep. You keep shining lights on my neurons.
Right.
Like, of course I can't sleep.
It's actually a problem. Like what you're saying is true, because the light that we deliver, we actually put in a tiny little implant into their brain to shine the light directly. It's kind of like you miniaturize a flashlight and you put the flashlight above the brain. And but it's actually a problem, because if you don't hide the light from the mouse, like we have to take these little fibers that are shining the light in there, and we have to cover them and make them opaque, because the mice will respond to the light. Because it's a very good point. The mice will respond to the light if they can see it. So we try to make it so that we can stimulate the neurons without them being able to see.
So Matt, who's funding this and why? Like, what is it that we do these discoveries?
So I've been actually very fortunate. We have funding from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. And so those are the two biggest federal granting bodies in the United States. And the National Institutes of Health, as the name implies, will fund health-related projects. Yeah. And the National Science Foundation is not necessarily health-related, but it's some scientific project of merit that's going to improve our knowledge about sleep. And so I've been fortunate to actually have grants from both agencies to fund different projects. But the goal is to just understand more about sleep. And part of my lab also studies food intake behavior. And so I'm fascinated by sleep and food intake, because they're behaviors that as humans and as animals in general, you don't have to teach an animal how to go to sleep, and you don't have to teach an animal how to eat. Animals, we just instinctively get hungry and tired. Or if you think about water intake, we get thirsty, but you don't have to teach a mouse how to drink or how to eat. And I'm fascinated by this from a human point of view, just because it's kind of I don't want to get too philosophical, but I guess it's a question of free will sometimes. It's just like you can't talk yourself out of being sleepy. There are some tricks you can do if you need to wake yourself up, that we can do, but it's almost like you're doing battle against part of your brain that's sort of already made the decision for you. If you're really hungry, you can distract yourself and you can play games with yourself to try not to be hungry, but it's hard not to feel hungry. You can't just say, oh, I feel like not being hungry right now, and you can't just shut that part off, or being thirsty. So I'm really interested in how the brain will motivate animals to go to sleep, or to wake up, or to find food, or to feel full. Those things, they're so well controlled by the brain that they seem like they just happen. They seem, it just seems like you just feel hungry, so go eat. But really, there's a very fine-tuned decision-making process that's happening in the brain that you're not conscious of, and then finally it hits you at a conscious level when you say to yourself, hey, I'm like, it's lunchtime, let's go eat. Or if you see a donut or something. And sleep is no different. Sleep is, it just seems so natural that you would feel tired at night, and that you would be energized in the morning. But it's actually a very complicated network of neurons that induces you to fall asleep and to wake up.
Let's talk about food, or actually we could just talk about any substance that you put into your body that either helps or hurts. So can you kind of run through a list of, like, what do you know about either when we eat, or what we put in our mouths, I should say, or what we're consuming, and at what time? And I'm particularly thinking about, like, hey, does when I eat dinner, whether I'm in a fasted state, and even other things like alcohol or cannabis, or some of those things, that how are they affecting our sleep, or CBD products that are so popular right now? Can you speak to that a little bit, about the consumption factor?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, to start, I would just say that eating right before bed, digestion is it depends entirely on what you're eating. So when you eat depends on what you eat. I think it's, if the worst thing that you can eat right before bed is carbohydrates. I think that's just if I had to answer your question in only one sentence, I would say don't have carbohydrates before you go to bed. And by carbohydrates, I mean sugars, but also starches, things like pasta and rice, but especially very simple sugars, like orange juice, things that would fall under the category of sweets, what anybody would associate as sweets. Candy bars, cakes, donuts. The reason for this is that especially for simple sugars, or like if you're drinking something like juice, or you have something that's just very carbohydrate dense, like frosting, is that your digestive system can actually digest these things very quickly, and your blood sugar level will rise very quickly. And as we were talking about the neurons before that decide for you whether you should be awake or go to sleep, they're very sensitive to sugars, and there's some specific neurons in the brain that promote wakefulness and keep you awake, and they become more active the more sugar is in your bloodstream. So one of the worst things you can do is have a lot of sugars before you go to bed. Have orange juice or something like that. And this is especially true in kids. So for all the dads out there, I think, every parent knows what it's like to give your kids sugar as they get really hyper and they run around. And so obviously the effects of this at nighttime is really bad. Alcohol is another interesting thing, because alcohol is very ironic, because a lot of times people will deliberately have a drink because it makes them feel sleepy. It's like alcohol is a depressant, right? So some people deliberately have a glass of red wine, or a glass of, like some whiskey or something. There's a lot of movies, actually. I mean, like, how many movie scenes have you seen where at the end of the day, somebody comes home from work and then they
Nightcap.
A nightcap. Exactly. The term nightcap implies it's like, it's a way to just, get rid of the day. And, there's truth to it. I mean, obviously, if it helps you relax, I mean, it's, there is truth to that it for some people, it really helps them unwind. And it is a depressant, so it does help you fall asleep. That's the ironic thing about it. But what's paradoxical about this is that when alcohol gets into your system, the liver metabolizes the alcohol. And what does it metabolize the alcohol into? It metabolizes it into carbohydrates. So, you know, if you have red wine or a beer or a nightcap of any sort, it might actually help you to fall asleep. And there is truth. It definitely might help you to get to sleep faster. However, an hour or two after you fall asleep, the body is going to convert the alcohol into sugars, and you're basically, it's like you just had a donut before you went to bed. And so I guess this sort of gets into the issue of sleep quality as well, is because you might not even know that your sleep quality is diminished. Although a lot of times I've heard, when I tell people this, people say, oh, right, because sometimes I'll have a drink before I go to bed, and then I'll wake up 2 hours later or 3 hours later, and I'll feel, you know, kind of weird, or I'll have to, you know, I don't know. They wake up in the middle of the night and they tell me that. And so that's definitely maybe because their body has been metabolizing the alcohol. But there's in most cases, I would guess that most people don't even know that it's affecting their sleep quality. Right. They might not wake up, but sleep quality is very different than sleep quantity. A person can, like usually when you think about getting a good night's sleep, you think about getting, 8 hours of sleep, or a really good number. And the number is really important, but the quality is another thing to think about. And the things that influence the quality of sleep is what you've been eating, also how much stress you're under. You know, if the more anxiety you're feeling, the more likely you're to have diminished sleep quality. And, you know, that's another thing we could talk about, is just, it's hard to control those things, you know, just like, well, what can I do about that? But what you eat is definitely one thing you can control. And so proteins and fats don't seem to make, you know, as much of a difference as sugars do. Sugars is one of the worst things you could have before bed. And actually some proteins, you know, are really high in tryptophan and things that are actually have been demonstrated to actually promote sleep really well. And so, you know, this is why, you know, there's like sort of a post-Thanksgiving effect. You know, you have a lot of turkey, or you have something that's high in protein, and that actually might be good for sleep. Though these days, you know, it's just something I've been really following a lot is intermittent fasting and ketogenic diets and things like that. And it seems like that's great for sleep as well, because you avoid carbohydrates a lot. You typically would avoid things right before sleep. And but I'd say that the two worst things you could have in terms of consumption is carbohydrates and alcohol.
Yeah, no doubt. I've been obsessed with sleep lately. And mostly coming from a place of a year ago getting some blood work done, where I said I had low iron, my hemoglobin was off, and I had a high erythrocyte sedimentation rate, which essentially meant that, for anybody out there listening, what the doctor told me was that I just had inflammation in the body. And what they told me was, they said, John, based on these things, it looks like there's some sort of internal bleed. We don't know what that means, or where it is, but like that caught my attention. I was like, that doesn't sound great.
Right.
I could think of better, commentary about my blood work, but it is what it was. So I got really obsessed with this, started paying attention. And then we had our dad's retreat this spring in Austin. Right. And I invited a man named Dr. Sachin Patel to come in, and he talked a lot about, it was all about health. But one of the things he talked about was this Oura ring. And so I'm wearing it. For those listening on the podcast, I'm holding up my ring. And for those watching on YouTube or somewhere, it's really cool. I actually wear it as a wedding band. They're about $300.
Okay.
And have you heard of these?
I haven't actually. No.
Oura. And then what it does is it syncs with an app on your phone, and you can monitor and track all of the sleep quality. So, and I'd love to get into that a little bit here with you too, because I've been paying attention to what things are causing, first of all, great night's sleep or not a great night's sleep.
Right.
And what this does is, and I know, again, those of you listening can't see what I'm holding up, but I'm just going to show this to Matt here. So that gives you all these stats.
Oh, right.
And then you can.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it's really cool. Like that's actually my sleep cycle right there.
Oh, wow. That's great.
So like last night, here's a great example. These are real numbers, right? So I was in bed for 8 hours. I slept for 7 hours. My sleep efficiency was 85%. It said I had an hour and 47 minutes of deep sleep. I had 59 minutes of REM sleep. And then shows my sleep stages. It gives me my resting heart rate, which was 44 beats a minute.
Okay.
And then anyway, so it tells me all these things. And so here's where I'm getting to the question of, I'd love for you to talk for a moment about maybe quality of sleep, because I have some interest
Right.
in like REM and deep sleep and the difference between those two.
Right.
I think that deep is like the way I've summarized it. Tell me if I'm right on this. Is like deep is like healing for the body. REM is healing for the mind. Is
Yeah,
the
that's the way I think about it. It's not as simple as that in practice, but that I think that's a
right?
good way to think about it. Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
that actually, to be honest, that's the way I think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's how I'm kind of processing it. And then I started paying attention, like what's affecting my sleep. I
Right.
noticed that when I was binge watching Game of Thrones, my
Right.
sleep was. I literally see it on the trend on the chart. It's like your sleep quality went
Right.
through the floor. Right. It was horrible.
Right.
But when I listen to light relaxing music and do stretching on the floor and read a book before I go to bed, my sleep goes way up.
Right.
And I was always amazed by that. And then other people, my buddies, started wearing new rings, and they were like, well, I noticed that alcohol really hurts my sleep. Like it
Okay.
helps me go to sleep, but I sleep worse.
That's good. So
So
that
it helps me,
validates what I was talking about. Yeah.
yeah, it helps me
That's
fall
great.
asleep, but I sleep worse. And
Right.
then other people were saying, and I think Ben Greenfield, who we just recently had on the show, was talking about some CBD products. And he was saying that certain genetic profiles, the CBD oil will help you fall asleep, but for other people, it actually hurts your sleep.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. No, it's true.
So let's talk about for a moment about quality of sleep.
Yeah.
And what do you know about that?
Yeah, no, this is one of those things. I guess when I was saying before that there were certain things I learned that I would get angry about that I didn't. I wish that, like, why wasn't I never told this? Because I had always been told you should get 6 to 8 hours of sleep. That was the sort of like from a hygiene point of view. By the way, when I say hygiene, I've actually learned to think of sleep as hygiene. I've learned, like if you want to take care of your teeth, you know how to brush your teeth, and you're told how to floss and use mouthwash and stuff. But I think hygiene it can apply to sleep as well. But it's not. I guess it's here's the metaphor is that if you did learn about oral hygiene and you learned about brushing your teeth, and somebody said, oh well, you should brush your teeth for 2 minutes every day, and that's all that you had ever been told, then you could be brushing for 2 minutes every day, but you might be doing it really poorly. And the quality of your brushing is matters just as much as how long the toothbrush is physically in your mouth. And quality of sleep, it's just so funny that nobody ever talks about that or what it even is. So the way I think about sleep quality is, typically what happens is you just brought this up. There's non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. And non-rapid eye movement sleep, usually it can be defined into different stages scientifically, but typically there's light non-REM sleep and deep non-REM sleep. And then rapid eye movement sleep is sort of an altogether different sleep stage. And when you first fall asleep at night, like if you let's say you go to bed and you fall asleep at 11 p.m., you'll go through a couple periods of light non-REM sleep that maybe last 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and then you'll go into a really deep sleep, and that's still non-rapid eye movement sleep, and that might last, your first cycle might last an hour and a half, but then you'll drift off into rapid eye movement sleep. And when you're in rapid eye movement sleep, you typically the first cycle will last maybe 30 minutes or so, and it's called rapid eye movement sleep because your eyes dart back and forth. There's a lot of movement between the eyes that happens, and that's where it gets its name from. But then after rapid eye movement sleep ends, you go right back into non-REM sleep, and you'll go back into sort of a light phase, a deep phase, and then back into REM sleep. And you'll cycle through these phases, maybe 3 or 4 times overnight. And so how this refers to sleep quality is, like, for example, when you just held up the app on your phone and you were able to trace the deep sleep versus REM sleep. So you can see your sleep cycles. Like what I was looking at when you held that up just now was I could see, yes, that ring is tracking you going into light sleep, into deep sleep, and so sleep quality is basically your ability to go cycle through those natural cycles of sleep just very nicely and very progressively, and not to have them interrupted. And when someone has a really poor quality night of sleep, their sleep actually, we call it sleep fragmentation. And what happens is the cycles become interrupted. They become much more fragmented, or you see a person going from one cycle to another much faster, or actually a lot of times people might even wake up, like it's not that you're just quickly going into REM sleeps too fast, but you might wake up actually, and just like you can see in the like over a night of sleep, all these cycles are interrupted by you're constantly waking up. And actually one of the interesting things too is you might not even know you're waking up. Like you might have 8 hours of sleep and then not even know that you
Correct.
woke up a few times, and you don't even know it until you look at one of these things, or you're somebody who watches you sleep sees that you're kind of every now and then you might actually even open your eyes. It's just for a few seconds, and so you don't remember it the next day. In sleep science, we usually call these micro arousals. They're just like very brief periods where you're awake, but not to the degree which you might actually remember it, and you might not be conscious. And so the more micro arousals,
some of the guys out there listening are like, yeah, I've had a few micro arousals in my in my sleep.
Exactly. If you use the word arousal carefully, then
yeah, you have to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. But yeah, the more of those that you have while you're sleeping, the worse the quality of sleep you have. And what I mean by that is that the worse intellectually you'll be the next day, the less creative you'll be, the less you'll be able to do athletic performance, the worse memory you'll have the next day. Pretty much anything you measure the next day is negatively correlated. The more micro arousals you have, and the worse your sleep cycle is. And so then the big question then is, well, what can you do to influence your sleep level and get rid of this? And so one thing is not having carbohydrates. The more carbohydrates you have, the more choppy your sleep will be. Anxiety plays a big role into this, and so it actually turns out that the more stress you have in your life, the more choppy your sleep will be. It's almost as if your brain is trying to remind you that you're
something's going on.
Something's going on in your life. Yeah, exactly.
Don't sleep too heavy.
Right. It's unfortunate, and then obviously stress is sometimes difficult to manage, especially if you've got something really stressful in your life.
Don't watch Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
right before you go to bed.
Exactly. Game of Thrones. If you're a student, and you're really worried about upcoming exams, or if you're working on a big project at work, that kind of stress, the daily stress can impact your sleep. And actually another big thing that can impact your the quality of your sleep, and this goes back to Game of Thrones too, is there's a neurochemical, probably a lot of people have heard about dopamine. Dopamine is a lot of times people think of it as a pleasure chemical, because it's the chemical in your brain that gets released when you are doing something pleasurable, whether it's you have a piece of cake, or obviously dopamine it's very heavily implicated in drugs of abuse. People who have a cocaine, or pretty much every drug of abuse, not every single one, but lots of them impact your dopamine system. But what dopamine is actually doing is it's actually regulating your interest in something. It's not just that it's giving you pleasure or reward. It's that it's actually making you motivated to seek something, or to keep seeking chocolate cake or cocaine or sex, or something that's pleasurable to you. But this is where Game of Thrones comes in, is that even something like Game of Thrones, or even if you're holding a phone, let's say, and like if you go to the YouTube app or the Facebook app, you see what you're looking at, but then all of a sudden you can take your finger and you can just see an infinite number of videos shine up. If you like this video, you might like this, an infinite number of these other videos. Or if you look at what one of your friends is doing on Facebook, then you just keep going like this with your thumb and swiping upwards, and you see, there's an unlimited number of Facebook posts you can look at. And it turns out every time you take your finger and you swipe upwards, you're getting a little burst of dopamine. And dopamine has very well been shown to disrupt sleep. It's dopamine that's flowing. So the Game of Thrones, binge watching, I mean, my guess is what that's doing is, especially, if you sit there and you're, it's getting to be 1 or 2 in the morning and you're binge watching something, or if your phone is the last thing you're looking at before you go to sleep, and you're holding it and you're swiping upwards all the time, then you're not only are you keeping yourself awake because you're shining a bright light in your eye and you're not, getting yourself ready to sleep, but you're also keeping yourself awake because your attention is, being drawn in, and you're getting more and more dopamine, which is keeping you awake. And it's the kind of thing that even when you do fall asleep, that dopamine is still able to disrupt your and fragment your sleep quality.
Do you have thoughts on the glasses that block the blue light?
Yeah, I've heard of these products, and actually, not only are there glasses that block blue light. I should actually just back up a step and say, like, the blue light is the light that has specifically been shown to it interferes with your circadian rhythm system.
Yeah.
So the more blue light that's hitting your eyeball is basically informing your brain that essentially that it's daytime, even when it's not.
Don't go to bed. Stay
Yeah,
time.
exactly. Yeah, there's
And you think there's like a primal part there too that's like almost like, well, yeah, I don't know if what I was going to say is going to make sense. No,
yeah. It's evolutionary for sure.
Yeah,
I mean,
for sure. Yeah.
I mean, this is a funny thing to think about, but the light bulb has only been around for less than 2 centuries, and so we've obviously mankind during evolution domesticated fire, and so it's not like we only depended on the sun for light. But when you think about it, even a campfire it's not like your whole visual world is lit up. Like if you're standing around a campfire, so for maybe a few hundred years we had candles, and I don't know the history of ancient times, but before the light bulb we lacked the ability to really flood our visual scene with light at night. And nowadays not only do we have light bulbs, but we have tablets and computers and phones blasting the light in our eyes, and specifically been shown it's the blue light. And so the iPhone now, and I think I have an iPhone, I don't have an Android phone, but I think they do the same thing. Is they actually
they have nighttime feature.
Yeah, exactly. Night shift.
I think it's really good I think it's a good strategy where, and I don't do this, but I've heard people do this, that they have certain lights, like certain lamps in their houses that are using the softer lights, not so much of the blue light. And what they'll do is that as evening time rolls around, they'll start to only use those versus all the lights in their house.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed personally that works for me, and this is a great hack, by the way, for all the dads out there trying to put their kids to bed, is I just find that starting to turn off lights. So what I'll start to do is if I want my kids to go to bed at 8, I'll just start walking around, start turning off lights. So that
absolutely.
By the time it gets closer to their bedtime, there's only 1 or 2 lights on in the whole house.
Right.
The whole environment says to their brain, I don't have to say it verbally, I don't have to say we have to get ready for bed. It's like it's all the cues, the environmental cues that are saying your body needs to, because I'm not speaking to them intellectually, I'm speaking to their internal right
exactly
system.
No, that's exactly right. They're hardwired.
They're hardwired, exactly.
They're hardwired to learn. Yep. But what they're really doing, if you take it to the next degree of sophistication, is the brain produces this hormone called melatonin.
Yeah.
And melatonin promotes sleep, and the more blue light that hits your eyes, the more that inhibits melatonin.
There you go.
So what you're doing.
I ask you about supplementation. Does that work?
It does for some people.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Like it does for a lot of people, especially in conditions of jet lag. So I think, melatonin is very safe. You can get it over the counter. You can get it at your drugstore or your grocery store, and it's very safe if you take the right dose. But a lot of people find it works. There's a lot of people who say that it doesn't work for them, or there's some people that say it doesn't work unless they're jet lagged. And so it's one of those things where a lot of things work for some people, but not other people, and you kind of just got to figure out what works best for you. But melatonin over the counter works really well. But I just personally find that exactly like what you said, dimming the lights at night for my kids and for myself is really good. So when I do read at night, I don't read under all the lights on. We have a lamp by the bed. The lamp light is much dimmer and things. And by the way, the opposite is also true. Like, what do you do when you wake your kids up in the morning? Like, probably the best thing you can do is to open the curtains, all the natural light. And that's what I do myself too. It's like if I'm really groggy in the morning, it's like I don't want to wake up, one of the best things you can do to intellectually you need to wake up. It's not like you're trying to convince yourself to wake up, but your body doesn't want to do it. And so if you open up the shades and let in a ton of light,
so true.
Yeah,
so true,
one of the best things you can do. Yeah.
Two final questions, and then I know we've got to wrap up here. But two final questions, and then you can have the final words. Anything you want to say. I wanted to ask about. Let's go with your genetic profile versus like your habits. So, how much of somebody's ability to sleep, or how much sleep they need, has to do with the choices they make, their diet, all that, versus just your body you were born to sleep 6 hours. They were born to sleep
Yeah,
8 hours, whatever it might be. Do
right.
you know how much is nature versus nurture?
Right. It's a great question. I think the two things where people show the greatest variability is you hit the nail on the head, is that some people are very lucky and they don't need to sleep more than 5 or 6 hours a night.
I wish I was that person.
Yeah, I really wish I was that person. I turn out not to be. You know, usually what people hear is somewhere in their life they've heard that you should get 6 to 8 hours of sleep a night, and so they say, "Great, 6." They think, okay,
Yeah.
but really what
And
it
I've
is
read
is
those
that,
studies.
right, right.
Yeah.
They, yeah, but I mean, just it's an inverted U. You know, if you ask, okay, well, how much sleep do you need to get each night? Across, you know, like what is the best night for you? If you measure this in thousands of people, most people need about 7 hours of sleep per night, and then 6 to 8 is sort of a good window. It's like if you get 6 to 8, that's probably good.
Yeah.
But there are some lucky people who it's really, you know, 5 or 6, and there's some unlucky people where it's even more than 8. Like maybe they need 8 or 9. And obviously this changes over the course of your life too. You know, infants, you know, we have a 1 month old daughter. She sleeps all the time. That's it. You know, she needs to sleep 22 hours a day out of her 24 hours. But and younger kids need to sleep a lot longer. But there really are people who need various levels of sleep, and the way to find out how much sleep you need, you know, because it's not like we come with instruction manuals of how much we each need. The way to figure this out, which is actually it's a little tedious, but if you ever get a chance in your life to not set an alarm, if you
When you wake up, right?
yeah, it's just basically measuring it. If you're sleep deprived, maybe you'll. Right. Maybe the first night you'll sleep 10 hours, and then the next night you'll sleep 9.5 and 9, and you'll slowly start to decrease. And then suddenly you'll realize, oh, I'm sleeping 7 hours every single night.
Yeah.
And so that for you is your golden number. So those people, well, whatever you are, you're hardwired for that. Your genetics say you need to get 6 hours of sleep, or you need to get 8 hours of sleep. And it's actually really impossible to change that. There's nothing you can do to say, you know, boy, I wish I could turn into one of these 4-hour-a-night people or 5-hour-a-night people.
Yeah.
You got to do it. So you just got to listen to your body, and you just got to adapt to it. But then the other area where genetics comes in, and sometimes people think this is a myth, but it's really not, is night people versus morning people.
Yeah, sure.
You know, people think that that's not very scientific, but it's absolutely true, is that there are some people who are really hardwired to be alert and
That's my wife.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. And then the opposite is true too. There are people who naturally wake up earlier in the morning. Is that you? Is that like that you're a morning person?
Definitely.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah.
And even our boys, like my son Ocean is like the early riser. He just requires less sleep. He wakes up on his own, never with an alarm. And
Right.
Tiger is there. Tiger and Tatiana are identical.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that's really funny. That's
don't talk with them for the first hour of the day.
yeah, because they're just no, that's funny. Yeah, my family has a mix of people in it too. That's which is interesting because it is genetic, but I guess you know it's like depending on the mom and the dad, you know, or you know wherever it comes from. But that's really hardwired too, and so it's not a unscientific to call people morning people and night people.
Yeah.
They really are. So I think what you just have to do is sort of embrace it. You can change, and so like actually because you know like people who are more of a night person, if you know you have to get your kids ready for school, and you're like, well, shoot, now I have to wake up at 6 a.m. because I got to make their lunches and I got to do this. You can adjust it. It's not like you're doomed.
Makes sense.
You always, you know, you can't do it. But you know, there's this unfortunate thing for night people that they're lazy, or that they're, you know, if they naturally don't want to wake up until 9 or 10 and they stay up late, that there's sort of a sense that they're undisciplined people, and that they, you know, just want to sleep in, and that they don't have good time management to stay up at night. And so,
I have a lot more empathy for my wife after you said all this.
Yeah, no, it's true. Actually, I didn't
know this was going to save my marriage, buddy. But
yeah. Well, the students at Williams, you know, it's just I you know meet students from all walks of life, and some people, boy, you know, the Williams Library is open till 3 a.m, and there are some students who deliberately sign up for classes that start very late in the day,
Sure.
and sometimes they're you know labeled as the you know people who why can't you just do what you need to do during the day? But
they know themselves.
They know themselves, and they function best. Yeah, you know, it's
Great.
Yeah, so there's truth in that, but you can mold it. Yeah.
Last easy question, and if you can even give this in one word if you want, is temperature. Is there an ideal temperature?
A little bit cool. I guess that would be the short version, is that if you had a choice between being a little bit cool when you're falling asleep and a little bit warm.
But there's not like I've heard 65 to 70.
Yeah. Okay. No, that sounds great. I would call that right in the good way. I definitely wouldn't say cold. Like like going to bed cold would be, disruptive.
Yeah.
And going to bed
Do
hot.
mice sleep differently with temperature? Is that one of your variables?
Yeah, it is. We don't do this in my lab, but that's definitely true. Is that if you change the temperature, there are optimal temperatures for every animal. Actually,
Yeah.
every animal has their own optimal temperature, and
Yep.
yeah, you want to be warm, but you don't want to be too warm. And so, like,
the animal that sleeps next to me likes it super warm. And I like it cool, which is why we're looking at these chili pads that you put underneath your bed. So I'm looking at it right now. Now there's a conversation about EMFs and does it emit EMFs, and so we're having this like heavy debate, ongoing temperature debate in my house.
Actually, one of the best things that I ever found, and my son loves this. I like it too, but my son really likes it. Is something called a chillo. It's just like a little pad you put in your pillow, and it keeps the pillow cold. And I love this thing because my face just gets so warm when I'm lying down, and this thing just will cool it down, and I'll just fall asleep so much faster with this thing. My son loves it.
It's called a chillo.
A chillo, right. Yeah.
And
it's not electric at all. It's just all it is a very, very thin pad that's filled with water, and the water, water doesn't change temperature very easily, and so when you're lying on this thing, you're lying on this little sheet of water, but you don't ever feel the water. It doesn't feel like you're lying.
You wake up in the middle of the night, it's boiling.
Yeah. Exactly right. I was afraid of it leaking, but yeah.
Hey Matt, I know we've got to let you go here in a moment, sure. But you can have the final words. Is there anything that we didn't get to today that you feel would be critical for these men to hear? And we know that we're talking about all this, guys, because we know this affects your ability to be in a great relationship with your spouse. We know these things are important to managing your emotions with your kids and also your kids' emotions. Like a lot of times we're angry at our kids because they're misbehaving, and what we're failing to see is that maybe their sleep schedule's off. I just had this conversation today about, summertime with our kids that they're staying up later, there's holidays, they're eating more candy, their sleep schedule's off, then their attitude's off. And before you start crushing them with discipline because they seem to be a little bit crazy, it's important to take a note that, hey, when their sleep schedule's off, when they're not sleeping as well as normal per se, or they're eating the sugars and carbohydrates late at night because they're binging on July 4th, right? And then we're sending them straight to bed. Don't be shocked if July 5th, right? Or December 26th or whatever, they act like lunatics.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think, if there's anything I would end on, it's maybe the way I started that TED Talk, which is just that, if you came into a new community and every single person was smoking, you would say, okay, this community has some sort of unhealthy smoking habit. And if you came to a community and everyone was constantly eating junk food and they all looked overweight, you would say, well, they have a bad relationship with food and everybody seems to be obese. And it would be you'd have to fight against that peer pressure. And same with, alcohol. If everyone around you was drinking, then you'd say, well, I'm surrounded by a bunch of people who you just have to carve your own healthy path. But the funny thing is that I'm at a college, and most colleges and most workplaces, it's the funniest thing is you see people who are sleep deprived and you don't have the same reaction to it. You don't react to it the same way as if everyone was smoking or everyone was eating junk food all the time. And it's just as bad, just for the reasons you're saying. It's bad healthy. It's bad for your mood. It's bad for your ability to think creatively. It's bad for your ability to go to the gym and lift weights. There's so many things I could talk for hours about sleep, but one of the things that happens when you're sleeping is that's when most of your growth hormone is released. And so, so I would just say, the number one thing that I hope people would know is it's just as important as all those other healthy habits, even though ironically we seem to celebrate a lack of sleep,
exactly right.
Right. So but no, it's a great thing to talk about.
Matt, I'm so grateful for you, man. Thanks for taking the time. We really appreciate you. If people wanted to go watch the TED Talk, what would they search for?
Sure, they could search my name, Matt Carter, TEDx Sleep, and I think that would take them straight to it.
For sure. And if they want to reach out, is there a way that they might be able to say thanks for this episode? Or
thanks so much. If they wanted to reach out, they can definitely feel free to send me an email. Even my email is mc10@williams.edu, or if that's hard to remember, just go to the Williams Biology Department and web page and find my name and Matt Carter, and I'd be happy to keep in touch with people over email.
It's awesome. Well, Matt, thank you so much, man. This is really important. This has been such a passion of mine recently. We've been talking a lot about it in the Front Row Dad Brotherhood in our community.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so important, man. It's so important for the health, the long-term health of our men in this community so that they can function at the highest possible level. I used to think of sleep as a thing that took me away from being productive. And now I see it as like one of the most important tools for being productive in my life.
Absolutely.
And, what you just said about even like the growth hormone being released in our bodies, that's when our bodies build. And it's just such an important piece. Like I thought about all my building happening during the day. And now I think about so much of my building happening at night when my body is repairing itself and building stronger neural connections, and my muscles are building because they're resting. So rest and digest versus fight and flight. I might fight and flight during the day, but when it comes to night, I've got to rest and digest. So this is so critical, man. Thank you so much, Matt. I look forward to continuing our friendship.
Yeah, definitely. My pleasure. Thanks.
All right, buddy. Cool.
Thank you so much.